What's up everyone, this is DR with the WoW Breakdown 101, and today I'm going to go over the top 5 hardest normal mode raid bosses in Mr. Pandaria. Now this is an opinionated list, however I did take in consideration the data to back up my claims, as these bosses pose the biggest blocks to normal mode raiding guilds and had some of the lowest success rates in each pool. Now before we get started, I know there are a lot of people, and I do mean a lot of people in the raiding community, that will say no normal boss was hard, and for those level of raiders, this is true. And I will get to your heroic list soon, this I promise. I have raided in both sides, the heroic progression focus guild and the normal casual raiding guild. And I love the heroic progression as it is truly where the best encounters are designed and where you will have the most fun raiding. However, the normal progression guilds seem to have a better atmosphere, and those raiders seem to have fun when progressing and just as much satisfaction, if not more, when down in a normal boss. Guys, if you are stuck in LFR and don't have a raiding guild, or you're stuck doing PvP, then I implore you to go out and try some flex normal raiding at the least and start your journey to heroic raiding. Now this is not a stab at any normal mode raiding guild whatsoever, but in most normal raiding guilds you will have 3 to 4 players that can learn and handle a new mechanic in a reasonable time, and 2 to 4 members that will take them a bit of time to grasp certain mechanics, and a few that cannot do any extra task in the fight other than tank, heal, or DPS. And there's really nothing wrong with that. However, there is no doubt that MoP has had the most difficult raiding counters out of any expansion for the normal mode raiding community, as many of the fights force 5 or 6 raiders to handle a certain mechanic of the fight, or as I call them, a piece of the puzzle. In short, there has never been an expansion where there has been so much individual responsibility in raid encounters. Okay, now let's kick this shindig off starting at number 5. It's Galoran, the third boss in Heart of Fear. As with many of the raid bosses in Mr. Pandaria, Galoran brought a new, fresh, unique encounter with mechanics mixed together in a way that a lot of normal mode raiding guilds have not yet seen. You had a boss that was a very large bug in a square room that had 4 legs that could be attacked. Not to mention a boss that did not have an aggro table, so tanks that tanked the fight actually did not tank anything. Instead, the boss would chase the raid member that had pheromones on them at the time, which became the first and only boss in Mr. Pandaria that some guilds just did not bring tanks to. As some guilds that had a hard time with the enrage timer would have their tanks go DPS spec or just bring a couple of rogues to stand in front of the boss and take the frontal cone attacks. Now to the pheromones. Oh, those lovely pheromones that just drove that bug crazy. Not to mention normal raid leads and members. Pheromones would stack pungency on their target, which would stack and place a void zone under their feet, which lasted the entire fight, and as the stacks increased, so did the damage of pheromones, which did raid-wide damage every 2 seconds, which meant that they had to be passed before the stacks got so high the heals could no longer keep the raid up. And once they was passed, Galoran would get pissed and do a crush that would deal high raid-wide damage that you wanted to pop your raid cooldowns for and be topped off for. Now to pass these lovely pheromones, your raid member that had pheromones on them would have to come within 2 yards of another raid member, and you would need to pass this between 4 people in a 10-man normal HOF. Not to mention, make sure that the void zone stayed nice and neat so that the raid had plenty of room. Oh, and let us not forget this. Pheromones bouncing back and forth and not passing when you wanted them to, and Galoran crushing over and over as pheromones played hot potato destroying your raid. Oh, and the dirt moments when your raid member stepped under the boss causing a crush, or when your pheromone kiter died and no one bothered to grab the pheromones off their corpse, causing the stacks to continuously rise. Then kill the legs, stand in the circle of the legs for extra damage to push the hard enrage timer. Yes, Galoran deserves a prompt number 5 in this countdown. And now on to number 4, and this is going to have to go to Shen and the Throne of Thunder. And while there were a lot of normal bosses harder than Shen, the road to Shen was one of the roughest paths that many guilds have ever faced, and by the time most guilds reached him, they ran out of steam and never getting that kill. There is no doubt in my mind, Throne of Thunder as of right now is the hardest raid instance that Blizzard has ever created. Now I know so many of you out there with your rose-colored glasses are looking at the number of players that saw the raid instance and are going to scream at me, "You don't know what you're talking about, DR." Sunwell had the lowest percentage of players seeing all the content. And while you're entitled to your opinion, and you may be right technically, Let's just keep in mind the state this game is in now compared to then. There are tons of guides out there and videos out there telling normal raiders and heroic raiders how to get past these encounters. World of Warcraft players have gotten a lot better since the good old glory days, and Throne of Thunder destroyed more normal mode raiding guilds than any other raid I have ever seen. Shen has around an 18.2% success rate according to World of Logs when I checked it. Shen was the pinnacle in this expansion of individual responsibility. During his intermission phases, the abilities that he'd done and the timing your raid had to have was very unforgiving. If just one person was out of position or one person did not use a personal defensive cooldown, then there was a very high chance that somebody or multiple people were dead. And being that your raid was so spread out at this point, if one person dropped, then it put a real strain on the raid to finish the phase, and if they cannot be B-res, more than likely it led to another death or a wipe. This was a brilliant encounter, and if the guild did not run out of steam, then Shen would actually go down in fewer attempts than the hardest boss in this encounter. Again, this was an encounter that was fresh, new, and very unique, involved a room with 4 rods that Shen interacted with, and depending on how your raid handled the encounter, would decide how the remaining phases of the encounter would go and how your raid would deal with it. Now, Shen was not the only Throne of Thunder boss in this list, and coming in at number 3 is Horrion, only the second boss in the Throne of Thunder, and one boss that tore and kicked so many normal raiding guilds in the teeth, which warranted him the nerf hammer multiple times, and yes, just now recently was nerfed in the Throne of Thunder LFR with the sight of the level 90 boosted characters that could not get past him in LFR for the cloak quest. Horrion will win the award in this countdown for the most damage done to normal mode raiding guilds. Now you may ask, if Horrion was nerfed more than any other boss in Mr. Pandaria and broke apart more guilds than any other boss in Mr. Pandaria, then why is he not number 1 on your list, DR? Well, let me explain before you turn this video off due to me not knowing what I'm talking about. The biggest issue with Horrion's difficulty is that he was the second boss in a 12 boss normal raid. The hardest normal boss in the raid being the second boss you had to face, and you had to down him to move on. Nice troll, Blizzard. Fortunately, Blizzard did notice this as a huge problem, and what came next was the best raid difficulty curve that Blizzard has ever released in Siege of Orgrimmar, as the bosses got harder as you went further in the raid. Now, what was it that made Horrion so hard for so many normal mode raiding guilds? You will be tired of me saying this, but yet, once again, another unique, fresh encounter. Let's start with the first elephant in the room. The sheer size of the boss presented tanks with something many have never dealt with before: how to position something so large. Not to mention Horrion would just run off charging and swiping some random raid member, so if someone was out of position, it was a nightmare to get Horrion positioned back. The room was massive, and there were 4 doors, which a flood of ads come running out of one door at a time. You had stuns, you had dangerous sand void zones that would grow in size, you had dinomancers that would heal the boss, drop an orb. You would have to click on the orb to force Horrion to close the door he was on. You had chain lightning ads, lightning totems, frozen orbs that moved, and poison ads that needed interrupted, and nuke casting ads that needed to be burst down and dealt with. The number of ads and priority of ads to kill, stun, interrupt, shit on the ground, giant dinosaur, charging, swiping around created so much visual clutter that many DPSers got lost and had no idea what to do. Yet another boss that required a shit ton of individual performance. Finally got all the ads down? Now it's just you and the boss? Well, not quite. Here comes Jalak down to wreck your raid. Now that he is down, you're homebound. Not quite yet. You just pissed off Horrion, who now attacks 50% faster and deals 100% extra damage. Very fun encounter, but as this second boss, come on, Blizz. Okay, now what bosses could be harder than Horrion, you may ask? Well, coming in at number 2 is a boss that success rate is sitting at 14.1%. Amber Shaper Unsock. What is it that made this fight so hard? Well, that would be just one ability called Reshape Life. When designing this fight, Blizzard must have been sitting at their meeting, and one guy over in the corner said, "You know what would be awesome? Let's put a mechanic into the fight where you get turned into a mutated construct, and you have an entire new set of abilities." Well, whatever the case may be, Blizzard just ran with it. So they start the encounter in Phase 1, where the tanks only get turned into the construct. Now this vehicle has it all, my friends. You have a wheel system that slowly drains, and the skills you use cost willpower. Once your willpower is at 0 and you have not left the construct, you will die. The only way you can leave the construct is to have been DPS down to 20% of your life. You can also regain willpower by absorbing puddles on the ground, but doing so will also heal you, meaning that your raid will have to DPS you back down. If Amber Shaper is on the tank that is in the construct, then he will drain the construct's willpower, so this requires a tank swap. And the first tank has to be out of the construct before the other tank is turned, and this happens every 50 seconds. That does not sound so bad, you may be thinking. Well, that's not all there is to the construct. There is an ability that construct casts that deals very high raid-wide damage, and the only way to stop it is to use a skill that you have while in the construct to interrupt the channeled spell. After your tanks have mastered this part of the fight, it is on to Phase 2. And now the tanks no longer get reshaped life cast on them, and there is another ad that comes into play called Amber Monstrosity. Now this is where all hell breaks loose, as now everyone except for the tank can be turned into the construct. Now, as you can imagine, while progressing through the randomness of different people having to learn the vehicle would be enough of a headache for the normal mode raiding guilds. Now, let's throw on top of that a raid wipe mechanic that the Amber Monstrosity casts that has to be interrupted by, you guessed it, a skill that the construct does. Now you have people in Phase 2 having to interrupt themselves and the monstrosity, not to mention they have to eat puddles to get enough willpower to interrupt the monstrosity a second time because the next person was not going to be turned fast enough. The learning curve for this fight was insane for most normal mode raiding guilds, and may have been a fun learning curve for heroic raiding guild. To prove how hard Phase 2 was, there was a common strat used amongst guilds that would actually allow guilds to bypass Phase 2 altogether by keeping the boss in Phase 1 for as long as possible and building up the debuff by only the tanks placing the stack on the Amber Shaper while in the constructs. Then once the Amber Shaper was a high enough debuff, they would wait till he channeled Amber Scalpel, which was only a 10-second cast, pop hero and blow the boss up. Phase 3 was an all-out DPS race to the end, with almost all of your raid by the time he died being turned into a construct. And if you had just 2 people that struggled with this mechanic, it was a nightmare as there was constantly AoE damaging your raid to death. I have to say, this was my least favorite encounter in all of Mr. Pandaria. Alright everybody, let's get the drum rolls rolling, and coming in at number 1 is 10-man normal Garrosh. This encounter has the potential to be a fairly easy encounter. However, when you couple the length of the encounter, the zoning in and out during Phase 2, the adds that had to be dealt with perfectly or near perfect, the high DPS requirement to push Phase 2 and 3 fast enough to not be problematic, and the mind control makes for a well-rounded, hard normal mode encounter. The 10-man normal version of Garrosh has only a 10% success rate. That is 9 wipes every 10 pulls. The common strat in the 25-man version of this encounter was to kite the adds and never deal with them, leaving a lot more uptime on Garrosh, which made the 25 normal mode much easier. And the 10-man normal Garrosh common strat was to spread the adds out and simply kill them. If you had a prop pally in the counter before Blizzard hotfixed them, then you was in for a bad time when you tried this strat. The strat that we actually went with in our raid group when we downed Garrosh was to pop hero after the first mind control in the second phase, so that we pushed him into Phase 3 without having to deal with an empowered whirling corruption. Then in Phase 3 we only had to deal with one empowered whirling corruption and just ignore the adds and blew up Garrosh. Due to the sheer size of the room and the different raid comps and the different raiders, there was a countless number of strats to down this boss. By the time that most normal mode raiding guilds got to this point, most were at about 550 plus item level, and there was talk on the forums that the first few heroic bosses were actually easier than a 10-man normal Garrosh, which had guilds for the first time ever bringing someone in that could switch the raid to heroic so that they could down a heroic Immersius and heroic Neuroshen to get gear to down the normal mode Garrosh. Now how backwards does that sound to you? Downing a heroic boss so that you can get gear to down the normal boss in the same raid instance. Imagine if Garrosh fight would have been the second boss in the Siege of Orgrimmar with a success rate of 10%. How many guilds would he have killed? When you put the numbers up and how long guilds have been raiding normal Siege of Orgrimmar, Garrosh stands as the most fitting final normal mode boss for the majority of the raiding community. Let's make no mistake about it, Mr. Pandaria has gave us some of the best raiding that any expansion has ever given us, and has created one of the healthiest raiding communities that World of Warcraft has ever had. That is my top 5 and is based on my opinions, and as I'm sure many of you will disagree, and some may agree, leave your top 5 list in the comments section below. If you like this video, then give it a like, share, and subscribe to help me put out more content and guides to help out our raiding community. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you again next time, guys.